Welcome to Chapter 5, Ceilings and Floors. In this unit, we'll be looking at what happens when the government intervenes in the market. So far, we've talked about a hands-off approach, but we know that the government gets involved sometimes. So what are we going to learn about? Well, the learning targets for this lecture are the meaning of price controls, one way that the government intervenes, how price controls can create problems and make things rather inefficient, why economists are often kind of skeptical and leery of price controls, and who benefits and who loses from price controls, and why they are used despite their well-known problems. We'll look at a few of these in the slides to come. So government controlling prices. So they intervene in the market and change the price. Two terms that you need to know are price ceiling and price floor. And then we'll talk more extensively about each of them. Price ceiling is the maximum price sellers are allowed to charge for a good or service. An example of that might be rent control. Maybe they can get $2,000 a month in rent in the equilibrium price. But the government thinks that's way too high for some people. Maybe it should only be $1,000 for rent. And so they set that as the ceiling. That's the maximum that people can buy that for now, as a price ceiling. So it'll be located below the equilibrium. You can kind of see this in the picture right here. That's below the equilibrium. I'll move out of the way so you can see that a little bit better. There it is. And a price floor, though, is going to be the minimum price that buyers are required to pay for a good or service. So one example of that might be minimum wage. Maybe minimum wage could be $5. But instead, the government says, no, that's not enough for people to live on. We want it to be closer to $7. And so they put in a price floor. So to be effective, a price floor would have to be up here, above the equilibrium. Let's talk about price ceilings first. So this is when the government will set a maximum price for a good below the equilibrium. This is called, again, a price ceiling. Now, some people do get confused a little bit because they think ceiling must be above the equilibrium because it's ceiling. But again, it's a ceiling. I cannot go above it. So it's still, to be effective, has to be right here, below the equilibrium. So here's a ceiling. I can't go above it. So just a way to think about it. So why would a government impose a ceiling when we know that this may create a shortage? Well, this usually happens during a time of crisis. And so they weigh the costs and benefits, and they think that they need to put a price ceiling in to lower the price for us. So that might happen during wars, harvest failures, or natural disasters, because these events often lead to a sudden increase in price. Some examples that I have written below are during World War II. You have U.S. government imposed ceilings on aluminum and steel during World War II, and also rent control in New York, which I had mentioned earlier. On this slide, please just simply copy the supply and demand graph. I'm not worried about you having all of the numbers here. Just draw your price, quantity, and supply and demand, and then we'll add a little bit more to it on the next slide. Now that you've drawn your supply and demand graph, what I would like you to do is add in your price ceiling. Notice that the price ceiling, to be effective or binding, must be below the equilibrium, because this is the maximum amount that producers can charge for their good. Notice here that the quantity supplied of the good when having a price ceiling is much lower. And so before, where they would have been willing to sell 2.0 million apartments, now they're only willing to sell 1.8. So some of those guys or gals are going to use those apartments for something else. It's not worth it to them to rent it below the equilibrium price. Now let's look at the quantity demanded. What happens when that price is lower now? Well, all of a sudden, now you have some people that have been living in their parents' basements that are 35 years old, now might think, hey, I could go live on my own now. The price is low enough. And so all these people go out and want to buy an apartment or rent an apartment. And so 2.2 million people are wanting to do that. Well, this causes a shortage then, as you can see in the graph here behind me. The major downfall for having a price control is that it leads to inefficiency. And you can see that the quantity here is very inefficient. Producers are not going to supply very many apartments at that lower price. It also creates a deadweight loss. Now, consumer and producer surplus is calculated where the equilibrium price is at. However, when you put in the price ceiling, that decreases that consumer and producer surplus. Therefore, it creates a deadweight loss to society. The consumers that are really needing this price ceiling are those that are in need and those that don't have much money. But really, in reality, these are not the people that are getting the apartments. It's the people that have more money, and they can, since there's a long line of people wanting these apartments, the producers can choose who gets these apartments. And if you have a little extra cash to give them on the side, then you're probably going to get the apartment. Wasted resources. Think of all the time it takes to try to get an apartment now with all these other people wanting an apartment at the same time. It's going to be hard to get that apartment. Wasted time, wasted effort. There's going to be low quality. We'd like to pay the equilibrium price. The government's not letting us. And therefore, why should the producers make the apartments look nice? They're not going to be very well kept at all. And of course, if there is a shortage, we know that this would lead to a black market. Sometimes the government might impose a price floor on a product. So that would push the market price up instead of down. Again, it would have to be located above the equilibrium, as you can see in this example behind me. The minimum wage is a legal floor on the wage rate, which is the market price of labor. We talked about that earlier. Again, please draw the supply and demand graph, and we will add a price floor to it on the next slide. Thanks. To be effective, again, the price floor would have to be above the equilibrium because I can't go below it. It is the floor. If it was below the equilibrium, it just won't be effective because what you're saying is I can't go below that point. Well, if it was below the equilibrium, it wouldn't matter because we wouldn't get to that point anyway. So to be effective or binding, it must be above the equilibrium. As you can see here, it causes a surplus. If the price is higher than the equilibrium price, then producers will want to produce a lot of butter in this case. If the price goes up, consumers, they might find other alternatives. As you can see here, quantity demanded would go down. And that would cause a surplus of butter. No surprise here, price floors also are inefficient. And the reasons for this inefficiency are as follows below. Deadweight loss from inefficiently low quantity, so the quantity demanded is much lower than the equilibrium quantity. The inefficient allocation of sales among sellers, wasted resources, inefficiently high quality. The butter that we want, we would be willing to pay a lower price for a little less better quality butter. But because the price is so high, the quality is a lot much higher than what we really care for. We really don't care for that. We like it where the equilibrium price would be. And then the temptation to break the law by selling below the legal price. You can look at some of the cartoons below. Please note that I try to make fun of conservatives and liberals equally.